I was born and raised on this land. It's a place where life moves slow but steady, where each day feels much like the last, yet within that sameness lies something genuine. My ranch sits in a valley at the foot of rolling hills. To the south, it borders a river, and to the north, the pastures melt into the woods. It's not the biggest operation around, but it's enough to keep us afloat. There used to be plenty of folks like me out here. Small and mid-sized ranches blanketed this land like a mosaic. Cattle grazed freely on open fields while ranch hands herded them, shouting stories across the prairie. Things are different now. A lot of the land's been sold off to developers, and more people are leaving, unable to keep up with the grind. I don't blame them. Everyone's just trying to survive. Still, it hurts to watch a way of life, one that's endured here for decades, slowly disappear. My mornings always start the same. Strong black coffee brewed on an old cast iron stove and a couple of eggs fried up quick with some bacon bits. By 6, I'm up and about. While the city folks are still tossing and turning in their beds, my crew and I are already out driving the cattle to pasture and checking the fences. Today didn't seem like it would be any different. The weather was clear, though the wind rolling down from the hills carried the bite of autumn. The air smelled of dry grass, the faint smoke of a distant fire, and a hint of dampness from the river. It promised to be a long day, just like any other. There are only 3 people working my ranch. Charlie's my right hand, a man I'd call a real cowboy. He's been here longer than I can remember and probably knows this land better than I do. Then there's Bobby, a young guy barely in his 20s, still figuring out what ranch life is all about. And finally, there's Ray, a reliable worker, though not much of a talker. His job is to keep the fences and equipment in shape, which he does without fuss. Charlie and I decided to head up to the north fence. Yesterday, I noticed part of it was broken. Usually, it's the work of bears or elk, but this time there weren't any tracks. Maybe the wind? Though it hadn't been strong enough to knock down posts. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I figured it was better to fix it before it became a bigger problem. By noon, we reached the paddocks. There was more damage than I'd expected. Not only was part of the fence down, but one of the gates had been ripped clean off its hinges. While I inspected the area, Charlie wandered off to look for tracks. He came back a few minutes later, shrugging. Nothing. No bear claws, no hoof prints. Like someone just decided to mess around and vanish. Things like that always put me on edge. Nature leaves marks, unless it doesn't want to. But who or what could have done this, I couldn't say. We got the fence patched up and headed back to the ranch. By the time we finished, my arms and legs ached. That kind of tiredness is familiar. It finds you every evening out here. We checked the cattle again. The cows seemed unbothered, grazing lazily, occasionally lifting their heads to glance around before returning to their meal. Evenings on the ranch are special. As the sun dips toward the horizon, it casts the sky in hues of gold and orange. It's in those quiet moments that you're reminded why you keep going. Out here, surrounded by land that holds every hardship and triumph, you feel like part of something larger than yourself. I cherish those still minutes. They remind me why I haven't packed up and left like so many of my neighbors. In the silence, among this land that remembers every storm and every harvest, you find a sense of belonging. The night passed quietly. Over dinner, Charlie, Bobby, and I sat around the big wooden table. None of us said much. Silence is a natural thing on the ranch. Before bed, I stepped out onto the porch and looked out over the pasture. The moon was bright, as it always is in these parts, turning the grass into a shimmering silver sea. Near the edge of the woods, something moved. I thought it might be an elk or a coyote, but when I squinted to get a better look, it was gone. Later, lying in bed, I found myself thinking about how nature has a way of watching. And when it does, you can feel it. Feel it on your skin. It was one of those moments. Still, I was too tired to dwell on it and fell into a deep sleep. The next morning, I woke up a bit later than usual. A faint noise outside the window roused me. The wooden floor creaked under my weight as I walked over and peered out. Nothing. Just the quiet dawn spreading gray and pink across the sky. Maybe it was just the wind rattling the shutters. Morning began like always. I lit the stove, brewed a pot of coffee, and let its rich aroma fill the kitchen. The cast iron skillet heated quickly as I fried up some bacon and eggs. Meals on the ranch are simple, but they're enough to fuel a day's work. After breakfast, I stepped onto the porch where a crisp autumn breeze greeted me. The air was damp, and I figured a light rain must have passed nearby. My crew was already busy. Charlie was under the truck's hood, tinkering with something, while Bobby trudged toward the paddocks. I appreciated his effort. He wasn't one to slack off. But it was clear he was still finding his footing. His movements were awkward, like he was still learning how to handle a saddle or wrangle livestock properly. "Morning," I called to Charlie. "If you can call it that," he muttered, not looking up. "Damn carburetor's acting up again." We started the day by inspecting the paddocks, a routine task I could have done in my sleep. Check the fences. Make sure the livestock's healthy, and see that the water troughs are filled. But as we approached one of the far corners of the pasture, something felt off. One of the cows was lying on the ground. It wasn't moving, and flies were already starting to gather. As I got closer, it was clear this wasn't natural. The cow's flanks were torn open, blood soaking the earth beneath it. Attacks like this weren't unheard of. Wolves or bears sometimes came down from the hills. But this was different. There were no claw marks, no bite patterns I recognized. When it came to things like this, I always trusted Charlie. "A predator, sure, but take a look at these tears on the body," I said, crouching down beside the carcass. "What do you think?" Charlie stood a little ways off, rubbing his chin. He looked thoughtful, but said nothing. It was one of those moments when silence spoke louder than words. Charlie, for all his years on the ranch, might have had an inkling that something wasn't right here, but like me, he wasn't one to jump to conclusions. "Could be a wolf," he finally said. "But wolves don't have teeth like that. What else could it have been?" He shrugged, and I felt a strange unease creeping over me. Charlie wasn't the type to be easily stumped. If even he couldn't pinpoint what had done this, it meant we were dealing with something out of the ordinary. Back at the ranch, I called the Livestock Commission. They were the ones who handled incidents like this in the county, especially when predator attacks started posing a threat to cattle. While I explained what had happened over the phone, Charlie and Bobby were outside tending to the equipment. By the time I finished the call, the sun had climbed higher into the sky and the day's work was in full swing. The more I thought about what had happened, the stronger the unease grew. I wasn't the kind to let my mind wander into dark places, not with the constant demands of ranch life. Fences break, cattle stray, predators attack. That's just the way it goes. But something about this felt different, harder to pin down. After lunch, a truck from the Livestock Commission pulled up. It was one of their younger agents, a man in his early 30s. I'd seen him before when he'd come out to neighboring ranches. He examined the cow's body, snapped a few photos, and jotted down notes in his clipboard. Hard to say what it was, he said as he headed back to his truck. We'll check for tracks if there are any. Could be a coyote, a wolf, maybe even a bobcat. I only nodded. Answers that didn't clarify anything were always the hardest to stomach. That evening I told Charlie to stay vigilant. I also warned Bobby not to wander too far from the house. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world around us seemed to still. Even the dogs, who usually barked at anything passing by, were unusually quiet. It struck me as odd. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, I was already up. There was work to be done. Animals to tend, fences to check, pastures to inspect. The dead cow was still on my mind, but ranch life doesn't leave much room for dwelling on things. The rhythm of it doesn't slow down, and if you try to pause, it'll run you over. Charlie and I headed out to the western pasture, where the cattle usually gathered in the morning. As we rode, my thoughts drifted to how much hinges on the simplest things: a sturdy fence, a secure gate. These might seem trivial at first glance, but one oversight could cost dozens of head of cattle, and that's a risk no rancher can afford to take. "The fence up north holding up?" I asked Charlie. "Yeah, checked it yesterday. Looks solid. It was a short exchange, but there was something heavier behind it." Both of us knew that problems don't always show themselves right away. Sometimes they build up quietly, like a weight you only notice when it's too late. When we reached the pasture, I paused to survey the herd. The cows were grazing peacefully, their heads moving slowly as they tore at the grass. On the surface, everything seemed normal. We spent over an hour walking the perimeter, inspecting the fences and looking for any signs of predators. There was nothing unusual. Back at the ranch, I got to work in the yard. Ranch life is a constant cycle of fixing, painting, replacing. Today I decided to tackle the old feed barn. It had been in need of repairs for a while, and I'd put it off long enough. While I was hammering boards and driving nails, Bobby was out helping in the paddocks. He gave it his all, though it was clear the work didn't come easy to him. The younger generation isn't built for this kind of life, and I couldn't blame him for that. Times are different, and people grow up in a world far removed from this one. By evening, we all made our way back to the house. Dinner was simple but hearty: stewed beef with potatoes and fresh bread. I ate in silence, mulling over what to do about the damaged fence up north. That section had always been trouble, and I decided we'd put in new posts the next day. After dinner, I stepped out onto the porch. The sky had already darkened, and a cold wind was blowing down from the hills. The air carried the faint smell of distant campfire smoke, mingled with the damp earth. I listened to the night sounds: the barking of dogs, the creak of gates in the wind, the occasional cry of a coyote. All of it was familiar, part of the rhythm of life out here. Later that night, closer to midnight, I heard a noise coming from the paddocks. It wasn't the usual sound of livestock shifting around. This was different. Short, heavy, like something large had hit the ground. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and headed for the door. The horses in the paddock were restless, moving around uneasily, but nothing seemed out of place at first glance. When I reached the gate, I stopped. Everything was quiet. I shone the flashlight toward the far corner of the paddock. The cattle were huddled together, their bodies pressed close, some of them nervously shifting their heads. But that was it. Then I noticed the tracks. Fresh hoof prints led toward the far edge of the paddock, which wasn't unusual. But trailing those hoof prints were something else. Tracks too large for any dog I'd ever seen. They looked canine, but no breed I knew left marks that big. I stood there for a while, scanning the fence line and the ground around it. Nobody wants to find a predator near their paddocks, especially at night. But aside from those tracks, there was nothing else to see. Back in the house, I tried to settle my nerves and convince myself that things would make more sense in the morning. That night, I slept fitfully. It felt like I could hear something moving outside, the faint sound of rustling or shifting near the house. Each time I got up and stepped out onto the porch, there was nothing, just silence. It was an odd sensation, one I couldn't quite explain. The next day started earlier than usual. By the time I came down to the kitchen, the sun was just beginning to break through the clouds, painting the valley in soft grays and pinks. The air was crisp, a reminder that autumn had fully arrived. I sipped my coffee, strong and hot, as my thoughts circled back to the events of the previous night. Those tracks near the paddock wouldn't leave my mind. Charlie and Bobby were already working when I stepped outside. Charlie was checking the tools while Bobby was leading one of the horses toward the paddock. Both of them looked busy, and I decided not to interrupt. Mornings on the ranch require focus. There's no room for idle chatter when there's work to be done. Today's main task was up at the northern section of the property. The fence there needed serious repairs. We loaded the truck with posts, planks, and tools and headed out. On the drive, my mind kept circling back to those tracks. Wolves occasionally wandered onto our land, but I'd never seen one venture so close to the paddock. And those tracks, they were too large to be normal. When we arrived, we got straight to work unloading the tools. Charlie began removing the old, rotted posts, while Bobby, though struggling, did his best to help. I stood back for a moment, surveying the area. The ground here was hard and rocky. It was going to be a long day. "Charlie," I said after a pause, "have you ever seen tracks like the ones by the paddock last night?" He straightened up, wiped the sweat from his brow, and looked at me. "No, can't say I have," he said after a moment's thought. "Might just be a big dog, or a large wolf. Something's not right though, boss." I nodded, saying nothing more. Charlie wasn't the type to speak without reason. His uncertainty didn't ease my mind, but it told me he found this just as unusual as I did. As we worked, I couldn't help but notice how the woods behind us seemed denser than usual. This spot was always quiet, but today, the silence felt different. It was the kind that made me glance over my shoulder more often than I cared to admit. The wind whispered through the treetops, and an occasional bird call broke the stillness, but even those sounds seemed muted, as if the land itself was trying to keep something hidden. By midday, we had nearly finished. The new posts stood solid, and the fence was back in place. We decided to take a short break. Bobby collapsed onto the grass, breathing heavily, while Charlie pulled out a canteen and took a few swigs of water. I sat on an old log, scanning the area once again. "Think the attacks will keep coming?" Bobby asked, looking up at me. It was rare for him to speak first. "We'll find out soon enough," I replied. "But we need to be ready." He didn't respond, but the look in his eyes said more than words could. The kid was worried, even if he was trying not to show it. Back at the ranch, I decided to take another look at the paddock where we'd found the tracks the night before. This time, I brought Charlie with me. We walked the entire perimeter, inspecting the ground and the fences closely. The tracks were still there, clear and distinct in the hardened soil. Charlie crouched down, studying them carefully. "Not a wolf," he said finally, "and not a dog either. These tracks, they're too precise, almost like someone wanted them to be found." "You think it's human?" "Could be," he replied, standing up. "But if it is, it's a strange one. Whoever it is, they know how to move quietly. His words lingered in my mind. I wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but what we were seeing didn't fit into any familiar patterns. That evening, sitting on the porch, I found myself dwelling on those tracks again. The horses in the paddock were restless, their movements jittery, as if they could sense something I couldn't. I decided it was time to be more cautious. I told Charlie to keep a rifle handy and stay alert, just in case the predator returned. Even Bobby, as green as he was, got strict instructions to stay close to the house and always keep someone in sight. The night began quietly enough. I went to bed, hoping for an uneventful rest, but somewhere in the middle of the night, a loud noise jolted me awake. It was a deep, guttural roar mixed with the panicked bellowing of the cattle. I quickly dressed, grabbed my flashlight, and rushed outside. Charlie was already by the gate, his rifle in hand. "Something's at the paddock," he said, his voice clipped. We hurried toward the pasture where the cattle were kept. The animals were in a frenzy, scattering and shifting chaotically. I pointed the flashlight toward the commotion and caught a glimpse of something large darting into the shadows. It moved too quickly for me to make it out clearly, but I could tell one thing. It wasn't any animal I'd seen before. Charlie and I began circling the area, trying to piece together what had happened. In the far corner of the paddock, we found another dead cow. Its body was torn apart, as if attacked by something enormous. But again, there were no clear tracks except for those strange ones we'd seen before. "Whatever it is, it's not afraid of us," Charlie said as he inspected the area. I nodded silently. The situation was getting stranger by the minute. As we made our way back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was time to strengthen our defenses. Whatever was out there wasn't going to stop anytime soon. I realized things were getting worse, not just on my ranch, but across the county. Since we found the first dead cow, the attacks had increased. They weren't confined to my land anymore. My neighbors were facing the same problem. Over the past week, I'd heard of 3 similar incidents. The cattle were restless, and the ranchers were growing more irritable by the day. That morning, as I brewed coffee on the old stovetop, my thoughts turned to the upcoming meeting. It was being held at the county municipal building, a place that had long served as a hub for ranchers to discuss problems, arrange help, or share news. But today's gathering promised a different tone. No one liked losing livestock, especially in times like these, when keeping a ranch afloat was already a struggle. When I arrived, the meeting hall was already full. Most faces were grim, etched with worry and frustration. Everyone there had suffered losses in the past week, and the air felt heavy with unspoken tension as people took their seats. Among the crowd were familiar faces, and a few I recognized less well. Folks grouped together, speaking in hushed tones, while representatives from the Livestock Commission, the Wildlife Service, and county officials prepared to address the room. The meeting began with Pete Riley taking the floor. Pete was the owner of the largest ranch in the area, a well-respected figure among us. "We're not here without reason," Pete began, sweeping his gaze across the room. "In the past 2 weeks, our ranches have taken more hits than in the past 2 years. Cows are being killed, no tracks are left behind, and we still don't know who or what is responsible." His words were met with murmurs of agreement. Heads nodded, voices hummed in low acknowledgement. When Pete stepped back, a representative from the Livestock Commission took the floor. He was a young man in a crisp uniform, clearly unaccustomed to addressing a crowd like this. "We understand your frustration," he began, his voice measured, though he seemed uneasy. "This is a difficult situation, and we're working on a solution. For now, we've increased patrols and set traps in key areas, but unfortunately, We don't have the manpower to cover the entire region." His words sparked a wave of disgruntled murmurs. Someone called out, "All you do is make promises." Others echoed the sentiment, and the room erupted into noise. I stayed quiet, watching the scene unfold. It was a familiar pattern. One side accused, the other defended, but in the end, no one walked away satisfied. "We can't just sit and wait for you to figure this out," said Jack Lawrence, owner of a neighboring ranch. "Every cow we lose is money we won't get back. We're losing our herds, and with them, our livelihoods." The young representative jotted something in his notebook and tried to regain control of the room. "We've already submitted requests for additional resources," he said, his tone growing firmer. "I understand the financial strain this puts on you, but believe me, we're doing everything we can. We've mobilized all available resources." The room buzzed again, though this time with less hostility. People were beginning to grasp that even with the agencies working at capacity, this wouldn't be resolved quickly. Pete stepped forward once more, raising his hand to calm the room. "We can't sit around waiting for someone else to fix this," Pete said firmly. "We need to come together and protect our cattle ourselves. I propose we organize joint patrols and increase the number of traps." The suggestion struck a chord. People began nodding, talking amongst themselves about how they could contribute. The tension lingered, but now it felt focused. At least we had a plan. After hashing out the details, the meeting began to wind down. I was about to leave when Frank Miller, my neighbor, approached me. We didn't talk often, but in moments like these, old ranchers always seem to find something to discuss. "Tough times," he said, standing beside me. "Sure are," I replied, watching the room slowly empty. "Plenty of work, but not much certainty. Expenses and losses, nothing but losses." He nodded, pulling a battered pipe from his pocket and packing it with tobacco. "How are your kids?" he asked. "Far from home these days. Their lives are in the city now. All I can hope for is that they remember me and the ranch once in a while." Frank gave me a sympathetic pat on the shoulder. "Kids don't want this life anymore. Ranching, cattle, predators, fighting the land. It's all in the past. Makes me nervous thinking about what the future holds," he said with a sigh. It was a familiar conversation, lamenting the younger generation, reminiscing about how things used to be. The thought struck me that every cowboy over 50 has had this talk at some point. After a moment of silence, Frank spoke again. "Not everything's bad, though. Just hired some hands, boys from Texas. Hard workers, I'll tell you that. Quick learners, too. Got a good eye for cattle." "From Texas?" I asked, only mildly interested. "How long have they been here?" "Couple of weeks now. Solid guys, strong. You don't see that much these days. Kids today spend more time on their phones than holding tools. These ones, different breed." We talked a bit more before parting ways. Back at the ranch, I couldn't stop thinking about the meeting. The situation was dire. State hunters were overwhelmed, the attacks were increasing, and we still had no idea what kind of creature was preying on our cattle. Traps and patrols. Those were measures that might have worked if we knew what we were dealing with. But the situation was spiraling faster than anyone could keep up with, leaving even the most seasoned cowboys and hunters at a loss. The morning after the meeting, the stillness in the air felt heavier than usual. I rose before dawn, as always. But instead of the familiar quiet that usually brought a sense of calm, there was a tense unease hanging over the ranch. Charlie was already outside, his old rifle slung over his shoulder, and a rolled-up map of the area in his hands. We'd planned to check the pastures and prepare a section where more traps would be set up. Over the past few days, the region had started to feel like a battlefield. Local ranchers and their crews had banded together for a large-scale operation. The plan was simple. Increase surveillance where tracks had been found most often and comb through the woods for anything unusual. "Boss, you think this'll work?" Charlie asked as we loaded tools into the truck. "No," I said curtly. "But what else can we do?" The road to the western section was desolate, save for the occasional figure of a lone cowboy on horseback. Each of them carried a weapon, their faces reflecting the same mix of weariness and unease that we felt. By noon, we reached the site. Several others joined us: Pete Riley, Frank Miller, and 2 younger men I didn't recognize. They were heavily armed, and no one batted an eye at it. We had no idea what was in those woods, but everyone was bracing for the worst. "This is where the last tracks were found," one of the younger men said, pointing to a spot near the tree line. I dismounted and walked closer. The ground was churned up, as though something large and heavy had passed through. But once again, there were no clear prints, no paw marks, no hoof impressions. This eerie absence of tracks was becoming routine, though no less unnerving. "Let's set the traps," Pete suggested. He turned to me and added, "You take a look at the northern edge of the woods. If there's anything up there, we need to know." I nodded, taking Charlie and one of the younger men with me. The forest was unnervingly quiet. Normally you'd hear birds, the rustling of small animals, the steady hum of life. Today, it was as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. We moved in silence, scanning the ground and the trees. Somewhere ahead, a branch cracked faintly, but when we reached the spot, there was nothing to be seen. "Something's not right," Charlie muttered, stopping in his tracks. "You're just now figuring that out?" I replied. "Nothing's been right for days." We pressed on until we reached a small stream. That's when I noticed the young man lagging behind. He stood motionless, staring into the trees. "What is it?" I asked, walking back toward him. The boy turned to me, his face pale and his eyes wide. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at a nearby tree. Following his gaze, I saw something strange. The bark had been clawed off in long, deep gouges, as if something with enormous claws had raked down the trunk. The marks weren't from a bear. They were too symmetrical, too deliberate. The scratches extended upward, disappearing into the branches. "Well, there it is," Charlie said quietly, gripping his rifle tighter. A chill ran down my spine. We headed back to the group, and I told Pete what we'd found. His expression stayed grim, but I saw his grip tighten on his shotgun. "Let's keep going," he said. "No turning back now." By evening, we had finished setting the traps and started making our way back. I left Charlie with the group to continue their patrols and drove back to the ranch alone. The road, usually dotted with signs of life even during tense times, was eerily empty. When I arrived, Bobby met me in the yard. He looked anxious, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The neighboring ranches," one of Pete's men. "They found him," he said, struggling to catch his breath. "Where?" I demanded, my voice sharp. "Out by the far pasture near the woods. He was torn up, like those cows." His words hit like a hammer. I jumped into the truck and drove straight to the location. When I arrived, several people were already there, standing silently around what remained of the unfortunate man. The body was mutilated beyond recognition. Deep, jagged wounds crossed his chest and stomach, his clothes shredded and soaked in blood. Nearby lay a hat, the only clue to his identity. Charlie walked up to me, his face somber but composed. "This isn't just about livestock anymore," he said. "The police are going to have to get involved." I said nothing, staring at the remains. The oppressive silence of the scene was deafening. All I could think about was the urgent need to find whatever was responsible and stop it. But how? I had no answers. After the incident at the far pasture, the unease on the ranch became constant. The death of Pete's worker changed everything. This was no longer just a problem of cattle. The death of a man forced everyone to confront the reality of what we were facing. The police showed up, taking measurements, snapping photos of the gruesome remains. Yet they seemed as bewildered as we were. This was an animal, one of them said. A young officer who clearly hadn't dealt with anything like this before. Judging by the wounds, something big. Maybe a bear. Bears don't leave tracks like this, Pete interjected, standing nearby. And they don't disappear this quietly. The police had no answers. They took the body and left, leaving us alone with our thoughts and fears. It was another sleepless night. I sat on the porch, staring into the darkness. The moon cast a faint silver light over the pastures, but there was nothing out of place, nothing moving. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, unwilling to disturb the oppressive silence. The next morning I met with Charlie. He looked like he hadn't slept either. We both knew we couldn't keep going like this. Something had to be done, or the attacks would continue, and so would the deaths. We can't just sit around waiting, he said. One more body and people are going to start panicking. I nodded, unable to find the right words. Making plans in the middle of this chaos felt impossible, but doing nothing was worse. Later that day, Frank Miller showed up at the ranch. He looked grimmer than usual. We sat in the kitchen over coffee and he started talking. "You heard about Pete's worker?" he asked, avoiding my eyes. "We were there," I replied. It was a terrible sight. Frank was quiet for a moment before continuing. "People are getting scared. Some are already talking about selling their ranches and leaving. They don't want to stick around and wait to be the next target. Predators have attacked people before." "You think running will help?" I asked. He shook his head. "This is different. We don't even know what we're dealing with this time. But I can't blame them. No one wants to be next." We talked for a while, going over the situation. Frank suggested pooling resources, organizing night patrols, and setting more traps. It was a reasonable plan, and I agreed. That evening, we gathered all the ranch hands and discussed our next steps. Night patrols would cover every section of the ranch, focusing on areas near the woods. The traps we'd already set were being checked daily, but nothing had been caught yet. Whatever we were hunting, it was too smart to get caught so easily. That night, I stood on the porch with my old rifle in hand. The horses in the paddock were restless, shifting and snorting as if they sensed something. Charlie and one of the workers were resting after a long day while Bobby stayed near the barn. I listened intently to the night, but everything was quiet. Too quiet. Later, I heard a faint rustling sound coming from the pasture. I tensed but decided to investigate. When I got closer, I saw the horses huddled in the corner of the paddock, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. They snorted nervously, their unease spreading to me. "What's going on here?" I muttered, scanning the area with my flashlight. Suddenly there was a sharp noise behind me, like something darting through the grass. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The beam of the flashlight swept over the ground, catching only swaying grass. For a few minutes I thought I'd imagined it, but then the sound came again, this time from the edge of the woods. I went back to the house and woke Charlie. Together, we headed toward the tree line. In the grass, we found tracks, large, deep ones. "Are we sure we're chasing an animal?" Charlie asked, his voice grim. "This thing's too smart." "Maybe it's Bigfoot," he added with a dark chuckle. we returned to the ranch. The night passed without further incident, but the next day brought more grim news. Another attack on a neighboring ranch. A cow was killed, and this time one of the ranch hands went missing. By evening, I gathered everyone left at the ranch. We prepared for a nighttime hunt. Each of us carried weapons, flashlights, and radios. We knew we might be facing something stronger and smarter than we were, but doing nothing was no longer an option. The night was cold and windy. We split into groups, each patrolling a section of the property. I was with Charlie and Bobby. The forest felt darker than usual, the flashlight illuminating only small patches, while the rest remained shrouded in shadow. Suddenly, the radio crackled. One of the workers on a distant patrol spoke up. "We heard something," he said, his voice shaky. "It sounds close." I grabbed the radio and quickly replied, "Don't get too close. Wait for us." We ran to their location, but by the time we arrived, there was nothing. Only a broken branch and deep tracks in the ground. The air carried a strong, unpleasant smell I couldn't place. "It's toying with us," Charlie said, crouching to examine the tracks. "This isn't random." The rest of the night passed without further incidents, but the tension was palpable. We returned to the ranch exhausted and frustrated. This hunt was going to be long, and possibly the hardest one of our lives. After the failed hunt, it became clear that our current methods weren't working. The traps we'd set went untouched, and the predator continued to elude us. Every day we delayed gave it the upper hand, while we only suffered more losses. Charlie was the first to suggest a new approach. "We need bait," he said. "If it's hunting cattle, we can use that against it," Charlie said over his morning coffee. "The key is picking the right spot and setting the trap properly." I nodded, mulling over his words. Using bait made sense. But the idea of deliberately luring this creature felt dangerously ambitious. We still had no idea what we were dealing with. But what choice did we have? We began crafting a plan. Charlie recalled an old method hunters used for large predators like bears. It involved placing bait in an open area surrounded by concealed traps. The success depended on keeping the predator focused on the bait, unaware of the danger around it. "We'll need a cow," Charlie said. "A live one. And a sturdy cage. If we catch it, it can't have any chance of breaking out." "Where do we set the trap?" I asked. "At the clearing where we've seen the most tracks," Charlie replied. "It's open enough for us to watch from cover, but close to the woods so the thing feels safe approaching." The first step was building the cage. We used heavy-duty metal panels typically reserved for holding livestock. The panels were reinforced with steel chains at every joint, per Charlie's insistence. "If this thing is as strong as we think, the weak points will be the first thing it tries to exploit," he explained. The work took us all day. The cage was outfitted with a mechanism that would automatically lock the doors as soon as the bait entered. We used springs and levers to ensure it would snap shut quickly and securely. Next came placing the cage. We chose a spot on the edge of the woods near the clearing. The location was ideal. The open ground allowed us a clear view from our hiding place, while the proximity to the forest provided the predator with a sense of security. We camouflaged the cage with branches and grass, blending it into the surroundings as best we could. With the trap set, it was time to prepare the bait. We selected a young cow from the herd, one that seemed calm enough to avoid unnecessary stress. The animal was understandably skittish, but we made sure it had food and water inside the cage to keep it settled. "She can't panic," Charlie said as he tightened the last chain. "Panic might scare it off." At sunset, we tested the mechanism one last time. It worked perfectly. The doors slammed shut as soon as enough weight was placed inside. Now all that was left was to wait. The night was still and heavy with anticipation. We set up in a blind nearby, watching the trap through binoculars. It was me, Charlie, and Bobby. Each of us was armed, though I wasn't sure how much good our weapons would do. We sat in silence, listening to the quiet hum of the forest. Hours passed with no movement. The cow occasionally let out a soft lowing, but the forest remained unnervingly quiet. Then, around midnight, we heard the faint crunch of branches. All three of us tensed. Charlie motioned toward the trap, and we turned our binoculars in that direction. From the shadows of the woods, a figure emerged. It moved slowly, cautiously, its posture tense, as if it were sniffing the air. In the dim moonlight, I couldn't make out the details, but one thing was certain. It was big. Far bigger than any wolf or bear I'd ever seen. "That's it," Charlie whispered. We watched as the creature crept toward the cage. It paused, seeming to survey the area. My heart pounded so loudly I was afraid it would give us away. The creature circled the cage, its movements deliberate and calculating. The cow froze inside, sensing the danger, but stayed still. I kept my rifle at the ready, but Charlie gestured for me to hold fire. The creature approached the cage door, its massive form looming in the moonlight. The cow let out a frightened bellow, but didn't move. The creature stepped forward, crossing the threshold of the cage. As soon as its full weight was inside, the mechanism triggered. The doors slammed shut with a loud metallic clang. The creature roared, a guttural, bone-chilling sound that echoed through the night. It lunged at the cage walls, claws raking against the reinforced metal. We rushed out of the blind, weapons raised, moving cautiously toward the trap. When I got close, I finally saw it clearly. It was an enormous beast, resembling a wolf but far larger. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural intensity, and its powerful limbs left deep scratches on the metal panels. "We've got it," Charlie said, his voice steady despite the roar of the creature. We quickly secured the cage with additional chains, ensuring there was no chance of escape. The creature's rage was terrifying, but the trap held firm. For the first time in weeks, it felt like we'd gained the upper hand. That night, no one slept. The beast continued to thrash and roar, but as the hours passed, its strength seemed to wane. It was our first victory in this fight, but we knew it was far from over. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the creature finally fell silent, though its piercing gaze never left us. "We need to move it to the ranch," I said, breaking the silence. "There's nothing we can do for it out here. We'll lock it in the old barn until we figure out what we're dealing with." Transporting the beast was no easy task. The cage was massive, and its occupant was as dangerous as it was heavy. We secured the cage in the truck bed with heavy chains, but the beast continued thrashing, shaking the metal bars with terrifying strength. Its roars reverberated through the night, echoing into the forest like a warning. By the time we reached the ranch, dawn was breaking in the east. I could see the gray light creeping over the pastures, softening the shadows of the hills. Using a winch, we lowered the cage from the truck and carefully rolled it into the barn. The barn was empty except for some old equipment we'd pushed to the walls. We anchored the cage to the floor with chains to prevent the creature from tipping it over. Only then did I take a closer look at it. The beast was massive, its long body covered in thick, dark fur that gleamed faintly in the light. The fur looked almost armored, dense and unyielding. Where the traps had left marks, the skin beneath was barely scratched, more like hardened hide than flesh. Its disproportionately large head held a powerful, elongated jaw. The teeth, visible when it snarled, resembled a wolf's but were much larger and sharper. Its forelimbs and hind legs were unnaturally long, and its oversized paws bore wide, curved claws that left visible gouges in the metal floor of the cage. It had almost no tail, just a stub that added to its unsettling silhouette. But the most unnerving part was its eyes. They glowed faintly yellow, with a depth that went beyond the instincts of a predator. These weren't the eyes of a mere animal. They belonged to something that understood it was being studied. "It's watching us," Charlie said quietly. "Look at the way it's staring. That's not fear, it's anger. And worse, there's intelligence in there." I nodded, unable to look away. There was a chilling awareness in the beast's gaze, as though it knew exactly who we were and what we intended to do. We spent most of the morning and afternoon observing it. Every movement it made was filled with raw fury. We attempted to sedate it with tranquilizers, but they had no effect. The creature didn't even seem to notice the injections. Its strength was otherworldly, its aggression relentless. Around noon, Pete Riley arrived, bringing some of his workers. Like us, they were bewildered. When Pete saw the beast, his expression hardened, his usual calm giving way to something more grave. "Life's full of surprises, but this," he said, standing near the cage, "this is beyond anything I've seen. It's no bear, no wolf. It's something that shouldn't exist." "We tried sedating it," I said. Nothing worked. Pete nodded, studying the creature with a heavy gaze. His men stood at a distance, shifting uneasily, clearly unwilling to get any closer. "Have you called anyone?" Pete asked. "We need to figure out what this thing is, how many there are, and how to stop it." We had already contacted the Livestock Commission and Wildlife Services. While waiting for them to arrive, we tried to make sense of the situation ourselves. Charlie speculated that the creature might be the result of a mutation or experiment, though we had no evidence. Pete leaned toward the idea that it was something ancient, something that had always lived in the forest but was now stepping out of the shadows. Maybe it had come from the reservation, he suggested. Time slipped by faster than expected, and soon the sun began to set, casting a warm orange glow over the pastures. Representatives from the commissions arrived and began examining the beast. Their faces were tense, their responses evasive. "We need to strengthen security," Pete said as we gathered in the barn. "If this isn't the only one, we could be in for a lot more trouble." Before anyone could respond, a sharp burst of static came from one of Pete's workers' radios. "Sir, something's moving near the woods," came a voice, tight with tension. "What do you see?" Pete demanded. The radio went silent for a moment. Then came a scream, followed by static. We rushed out of the barn. On the horizon, where the forest began, shadows emerged. They moved quickly, closing the distance toward us. "Guests," Charlie said grimly. "I figured this would happen. They know we have one of theirs, and they're coming for it." We bolted the barn doors and prepared for what was to come. The night had only just begun, and it promised to be a long one. The barn was as fortified as we could manage on short notice. Thick wooden boards, heavy beams, and chains securing the cage gave us a false sense of safety. The people inside tried to stay composed. Some reloaded their guns in silence, while others stood motionless, the tension evident in every movement. Outside, the silence was deafening, but it didn't offer comfort. Instead, it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. The first sound to break the quiet was a heavy thud against the barn wall. The wood groaned, but held. Instinctively, everyone aimed their weapons at the doors and windows. "They're here," Pete said calmly, taking a position near the entrance. The next impact was harder, followed by more blows from all sides. It felt like the creatures were testing the barn's strength, searching for weak points. Deep scratches appeared on the walls as claws tore into the wood. Even the roof wasn't spared. Above us, heavy steps creaked across the beams. Charlie was the first to fire. The sharp crack of his rifle echoed through the barn, forcing the creature on the roof to retreat. The others followed suit, firing at the doors and windows. The sounds of gunfire mixed with the thuds and roars of the creatures outside. "Hold your positions, don't let them in," Pete commanded, his voice steady despite the chaos. One of the beasts managed to break through. Its claws ripped a plank from the wall, creating a hole just large enough for a massive paw to reach through. The creature howled and snarled, but Charlie fired a shot, hitting it squarely. The paw recoiled, and two of Pete's workers hurriedly patched the gap with spare boards. Yet the wall groaned ominously under the relentless assault. "There's more of them than I thought," muttered one of the commission officials, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Outside, the pounding intensified. The creatures weren't acting randomly. Their attacks were deliberate, almost coordinated, probing different areas of the barn. They scaled the walls, clawed at the doors, and roared at the windows. A loud crack above us drew everyone's gaze upward. Part of the roof had buckled under the weight of one of the creatures. It clawed furiously, trying to tear a hole through the planks and beams. Shots rang out as we fired at the ceiling, momentarily driving it back. But the reprieve was short-lived. It returned, more ferocious than before, ripping through the boards with renewed vigor. "I'll get more boards for reinforcement," one of Pete's men said, sprinting toward a pile of equipment stacked against the far wall. Then, abruptly, the noise outside stopped. The pounding, the clawing, the snarling, it all ceased at once. Inside we froze. The only sound was the heavy breathing of those of us still standing. The silence was more unnerving than the attack itself. "What are they planning?" Bobby whispered, his wide eyes darting around the barn. The answer came from inside the cage. The captured beast, which had been thrashing moments earlier, suddenly stilled. It lifted its massive head and let out a deep, guttural sound. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but something rhythmic and deliberate, an eerie blend of ululating and rumbling. Then came the reply. Outside, a similar sound echoed, louder and sharper. It wasn't the call of an animal. It was something distinct, almost calculated. The creatures were communicating. Each response from outside differed slightly in tone and duration, as if part of a dialogue. "They're talking," Pete said, his face grim. "They know what they're doing." Charlie moved closer to the cage, his rifle at the ready. The beast inside continued its haunting calls, its glowing yellow eyes flickering with unsettling awareness. It wasn't just calling, it was giving orders. Outside, the creatures resumed their assault, but now their movements were more focused. They concentrated on one area of the wall, then shifted to the roof. Another clawed through a section of the boards, forcing us to hurriedly patch the breach. "They're following its instructions," one of the commission officials said, pointing at the caged beast. "We're running out of time," Pete said. "If they get through, none of us will make it." The barn trembled under the relentless onslaught. We kept shooting, hammering planks into place and holding the line. But the pressure was mounting, and we all knew we couldn't keep this up forever. The creatures outside weren't giving up. Their coordination, their relentless strategy, it was terrifying in its precision. This wasn't a simple hunt. It was something far more calculated. The night dragged on, each moment heavier than the last. The barn creaked and groaned under the strain. Walls trembled, beams cracked, and parts of the roof sagged where the creatures clawed their way through. It was only a matter of time before they broke inside. Charlie, standing near the cage, suddenly turned toward the center of the barn. His voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "We have to burn it." His words froze everyone. For a moment, the only sound was the scraping of claws and the ragged breathing of those inside. Faces turned toward him in shock and disbelief. No one wanted to consider setting fire to the barn we'd fought so hard to protect. "Are you serious?" Pete asked, glaring at Charlie. "If they get in here, we're dead," Charlie said firmly. "We don't have a choice. These things are smarter than we thought. If we don't destroy them now, they'll come back. Maybe not here, but somewhere else." "Lure them all inside?" I asked, realizing the plan's audacity and grim logic. "Exactly," Charlie said. "We open the main doors, let them come for the one in the cage. Once they're all in, we get out through the back and burn the place to the ground." Pete took a deep breath and surveyed the room. No one argued. Even Bobby, who often hesitated, nodded grimly and tightened his grip on his rifle. None of us wanted to die here. We moved quickly. There was no time to waste. The barn's back door was narrow enough for us to escape, but too small for the creatures to follow. We cleared the path to ensure it wouldn't jam when the time came. "We open the main gates," Charlie said. "Everyone else stays ready in case something goes wrong." I approached the cage, where the captured beast was growing increasingly agitated. Its movements were more violent, its snarls deeper. It seemed to sense what we were planning, and its glowing eyes fixed on me with unsettling intensity. "They're following its signals," one of Pete's workers remarked. "If we take it out, the others might lose coordination." "We can't risk that guess," Pete replied. "First we draw them inside." Charlie and two others moved cautiously to the main doors. The pounding from outside had lessened, almost as if the creatures were waiting for something. At our signal, they slowly cracked the doors open. A flashlight beam pierced the darkness, revealing glowing yellow eyes. Their silhouettes shifted in the moonlight, muscular and deliberate. The first creature stepped in, cautious but determined. "A little more," Charlie whispered, his voice barely audible. We retreated toward the back door, careful to make no noise. The creatures crept closer to the cage, drawn to the guttural sounds the captured beast emitted. Its calls were louder now, more commanding. The others responded, quickening their pace, their focus razor sharp. "Is everyone out?" Pete asked, turning back toward us. "Just two more," I replied, pointing to the livestock commission workers securing the last of the fuel canisters. When the final pair slipped out through the rear exit, we signaled to Charlie. Bobby lit the torch, its flame bursting to life with a fiery glow. The fire took hold instantly. The fuel-soaked walls and beams erupted, and the barn lit up like a matchstick. Flames spread rapidly, climbing to the rafters and consuming everything in their path. Inside, the creatures panicked. Those closest to the doors tried to escape, but we had bolted the entrances shut, reinforcing them earlier. The heat from the blaze reached us outside, and the air filled with their deafening roars and snarls. Slowly, the sounds began to dull, as if they realized they were trapped. Not all of them were caught. A few managed to break through weaker sections of the walls, slipping out into the night. We caught glimpses of their retreating silhouettes as they vanished into the forest. When the fire finally died down, the barn was reduced to ash and smoldering embers. We approached cautiously, weapons at the ready, to confirm that the creatures inside were gone. Among the charred debris lay bones, massive, misshapen, unlike any animal we'd ever seen. "That's all that's left of them," I said, standing over the remains. "Proof they existed," Pete added, though his voice carried a note of doubt. The morning after was oppressively quiet. The air hung heavy, thick with the acrid stench of burned wood and something metallic, almost sickly, from the scorched remains. The police arrived early, bringing with them representatives from various agencies. They surveyed the scene, taking photos, collecting samples, and speaking in low, anxious tones. The bones were their primary focus. No one could identify them, but it was clear they didn't belong to any known species. "These definitely aren't wolf bones," one of the officers muttered, "or canine of any kind. They're strange." I stood back, watching as two officials carefully packed the charred remains into containers. Their silence spoke volumes. They didn't have answers, only questions. "What happens now?" I asked one of the officers. "We'll send the remains for analysis," he replied. "For now, we'll increase patrols in the area. Hunters are already sweeping the forest. If any of these creatures survived, we'll find them." I nodded but felt little reassurance. Those of us who'd seen the beasts in action knew they weren't ordinary predators. If any had escaped, they wouldn't be easy to track or stop. By evening, chilling news reached me. A neighbor came with word that Frank, my old friend, and his family had been found slaughtered at their ranch. Their house was burned, the neighbor said grimly. And their bodies, you don't want to know. Even the police couldn't stomach it. I stood silent, trying to process what I'd heard. Frank had been one of the strongest among us, someone who believed we could face any challenge. What happened to him wasn't just brutal. It felt deliberate, like revenge. But there was something even stranger. Among the fragmented whispers that spread through the community that day, one detail stood out. A single boot had been found at the scene. It belonged to one of Frank's workers, one of the Texans he'd recently hired. Inside the boot was something no one could explain. A severed leg. It wasn't human. The leg was covered in thick, coarse fur, and the claws on its foot were long and sharp, identical to the beasts we'd burned. Some murmured it was a remnant of the creatures we'd killed. Others shook their heads, too disturbed to speak. I didn't know what to believe. But the thought that Frank's workers, the young cowboys, might have been connected to the creatures refused to leave my mind. The days dragged on. After that night, the county grew quiet. The attacks stopped, and people cautiously returned to their routines. It seemed the threat had passed. But the unease inside me remained. Every time I walked the pastures or checked the fences, I found myself waiting for their return. No tracks had been found, no sign of the survivors. The hunters found nothing, despite combing the forest inch by inch. But the lack of evidence didn't mean they were gone. Charlie knew it. Pete knew it. And deep down, I knew it too. In the evenings, I'd sit on the porch staring at the horizon. Autumn had fully settled in. The air was colder and the ground was blanketed with fallen leaves. But with the season came an unshakable sense of foreboding. Every time I looked toward the forest, I felt it. They weren't done. They'd come back. If not for me, then for someone else. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. And that day wouldn't be kind. They'd come back to take revenge, to settle the score for what we had done. And when they did, it wouldn't be a fight for survival, it would be a reckoning.